Hello, writers, and welcome back to Spooky Writes. I'm your host, who's secretly a ghost, Kamal Onor, and welcome to Spooky Writes. You better buckle up, because today I'm giving you a list of mistakes that you are probably making. How do I know that you're making these mistakes? Because these are mistakes that I was making when I was very early in my writing career. So when you get to the stage of submitting work, you need to do your best to not give an editor an obvious reason instantly. You need to do your best. You need to do your best to not give an editor an obvious reason to automatically reject your work. After all, editors receive hundreds and hundreds of submissions, and you don't want yours to be the first rejected, do you? So if you avoid these mistakes, it'll make sure that you are not the first to be tossed into the rejection pile, or even worse, deleted unread. So here's what you have to do when you're submitting your work. So the first thing you have to do when you're submitting your work to anything, whether it's a magazine or an editor or to a publishing house, you have to take your ego and put it to the side. Because we've all heard stories of the ego-filled writer who doesn't believe formatting and rules apply to him or her. These writers who believe that submission guidelines are merely a suggestion for lesser writers. I mean, surely all I have to do is worry about my story being good enough, which of course it is good enough because I'm the best writer ever. It would be ridiculous for them not to see my genius, even if I submit it in Wingdings or if I submit it in Comic Sans or whatever that I send them. They will know my genius and they will want to publish it instantly. Who cares if they don't publish demon teenage literature or fan fiction? After all, I know that my story is so good that they'll want to publish it right away. So I will just send a mass email out to every publisher that I see, and they will instantly contact me and want to publish my work immediately. All I have to do is let them bid each other out and see which one is going to offer me the biggest incentive to buy my work, after all. So if you are in the stage of submitting your work, prepare to be humbled. I will repeat it because I believe it's so important that when you're submitting, you have to take your ego and set it to the side. You have to put it in a box, you have to store it away and put it somewhere else, because you need to get rid of your ego if you're going to be successful as an author, if you're going to successfully submit your work. So with that warning out of the way, let's get into it. So let's start off with an obvious one. If you're not even reading what the call for the submission is, this is a big mistake. After all, not every publication publishes fiction, not every publication publishes poetry, not every publication publishes short stories or novels or novellas or whatever you might be submitting. You have to look at the submission guidelines to get an idea of what specifically that publication is looking for. You need to remember that every publisher is going to be different, and even many times publishers will put out themed anthology calls, and so just because they've published vampire literature in the past or werewolf literature in the past doesn't mean this is all they publish. You need to read the guidelines, especially if you're submitting to anthology calls, because anthology calls are going to differ on an issue-to-issue basis. So you have to read the submission guidelines, and the rule is, if you don't have the time to read the guidelines, why should an editor spend his or her time to read your story? Not understanding formatting. Now, every publisher is going to have is going to specify what they want for their formatting. A lot of magazines will use what's termed as standard manuscript formatting, so you need to know how to set this up in your Word document, or if you're using Google Docs or whatever writing program you're using, you have to know how to set up standard manuscript formatting and then how to deviate from this according to the publication submission guideline rules. Some magazines will specify and say we want stories to be submitted in single space. Most magazines will ask for double space, but some magazines request single space. Some magazines want you to submit in Arial, others say Times New Roman or a similar sans serif font. So you have to understand formatting. Remember, nobody is going to read a poorly formatted story, no matter how well written it is. You have to present your story in a professional manner. And so the number one way to make sure that your story is not even being read or is being deleted before an editor even takes the time to open a document is if you're submitting it in the wrong format. Again, magazines and publishers will specify what they expect to be submitted to them. Some magazines want Word documents sent to them. Some magazines will accept PDF format. Some magazines want you to simply copy and paste your story into the body of an email. And again, all of this will be detailed in the submission guidelines. So if you don't read the submission guidelines and you send an attachment and in the guidelines it says do not send us an attachment or else your document will be cast into the fires of Mount Doom, don't expect your work to ever be published by that publisher. So everything that you need to do to make sure that you are presenting yourself in a professional manner, beyond writing the best story that you can write, is to carefully read and understand the submission guidelines. Now, I know this will take some time. Early on, it'll feel overwhelming to be reading submission guidelines over and over again, and if you're submitting to multiple magazines at the same time, you're going to be constantly reading submission guidelines, but you need to read these guidelines because I've seen guidelines where at the very end of their big long list of everything detailed about what they want and what they expect to be sent to them, they'll put a little tag that says, include this in your cover letter, to include this line in your cover letter to prove to us that you actually read the submission guidelines, because editors are so inundated with mass submissions from people who are not taking the time to submit, who are not taking the time to read the submission guidelines, and this is the easiest way for them to trim out all of the excess submissions that they're getting. And again, you need to know the publication. You need to have an idea of what they publish. Do they actually publish the types of stories that you are writing? Do they actually publish the type of stories that you are writing, the types of stories that you are submitting? Now, this might feel like a little bit of an extra step, but trust me, it does matter. If you can find a masthead on the publisher's website, if you can figure out who the editor is for for the genre that you are submitting. Remember, some magazines will have a fiction editor, some magazines might have a fiction and a poetry editor and a non-fiction editor. So depending on what you are submitting, you need to address your cover letter to the editor-in-chief or to the editor who oversees your specific type of submission. And once you find the name of the editor that you are submitting your work to, you need to make sure and triple check this. Make sure that you are spelling his or her name correctly. Now, sometimes if you are submitting to a magazine that's newer and they don't quite have all this information easily available on their website, again, do a quick search around the website. Do a quick search and see if they've published any editions of their magazine in the past, and do your best to do a little bit of digging, do a little bit of research, and just search to see if you can figure out who the editor is and address him or her specifically. In your cover letter, put "Dear," name of the editor. And if you aren't able to find this on the website, if you're not able to find this, it's perfectly fine to put "Dear Editor." But if you're able to figure out if you're able to personalize your cover letter and personalize to whom you are submitting this piece to, it's going to go a long way, trust me. And then here is probably one of the biggest mistakes that people will make when submitting their work is they will send their work before it's ready. So you need to remember that there is no rush unless the deadline to submit is tomorrow, which you should probably be submitting work before it's due midnight that night. But you need to understand that just because this magazine has an open call doesn't mean that you have to send your work in. You need to make sure that your work is at a stage where it is ready to be submitted. You need to do several drafts on your work, especially with short stories. I write so many short stories and I do so much editing on my work that it's constantly in revision. And when it gets to a certain point, when I know that it's at a quality that I feel comfortable of sending it out into the world, I will then begin to submit that piece. And a lot of this does come with practice. A lot of this will come with trial and error, and you need to just practice it. And as you get better, you'll start to know when it's been enough and when you've done enough work on your writing to get it to a point where it's publishable. And then you need to just send it out and continue sending it out. So the reason why I'm telling you that it's so important to not submit your work before it's truly ready, before it's at its final draft, when it's at its final version, is because you only get one shot at submitting a story to a magazine, to a publisher. And if you submit a piece and then you realize, oh wait, I actually sent you the rough draft, it's not going to matter because they've already rejected that story. And so unless you do many magazines will specify that unless you do a lot of revision on a story that you've previously submitted, they don't want to see that same story again. You're more than welcome to submit a different story entirely, but if so you don't want to shoot yourself in the foot. You want to give your story the best chance to be published. So remember, there's no reason to rush your writing, no reason to rush and try and just skimp on edits, try and submit stories before they are truly ready to be sent out there. Because once a magazine gives you a rejection, that's the last time that you should be submitting that story to that publication. Then you also need to understand what the difference is between magazines that accept multiple submissions and publishers that accept simultaneous submissions. So multiple submissions means that you can send more than one piece at a time, where simultaneous submissions means that your piece can be submitted to other magazines or other publishers while you're submitting it to this publisher. And so the best thing that you can truly do to give your work the best chance to be published is to read the submission guidelines, is to only submit to magazines that you personally have read some of, that you have an idea of what they publish, and you know, whether doing your own research or through word of mouth, you know who the editor of that publication is, and you can address him or her directly. Remember, spell their name correctly, and it will go a long way. And with that, keep it spooky. And of course, here's your writing prompt for sticking all the way through the end of the video. Jennifer ran along the road. When she turned, she saw blank. So set your timer and start writing. Thank you so much.